I never believed in ghosts until one called me his bride. It began with desperation, as most dangerous things do, and I remember standing before the iron gates of Blackmere Manor on that October evening, the fog curling around my ankles like a living thing, thinking that no sum of money could be worth what I was about to do. But I was wrong, of course. Desperation has a way of making us believe we can survive anything, and poverty has a way of stripping us of the luxury of fear. My name is Vivian Hartley, and in the autumn of 1889, I was 24 years old, unmarried, and the sole provider for a mother whose health had been failing since my father's death 3 years prior. We had sold everything of value. The silver had gone first, those beautiful Georgian pieces that had been in my mother's family for generations. Then the paintings, including the portrait of my grandmother that had hung in our parlor since before I was born. Then the furniture piece by piece until our modest home in Cheapside felt more like a mausoleum than a dwelling. I had taken in sewing, had given lessons in French and piano, had done everything a respectable woman could do to earn money without sacrificing her reputation. But it was not enough. It was never enough. When I saw the advertisement in the London Chronicle, I thought it must be a jest. Some bored aristocrat amusing himself at the expense of the desperate. £100 to spend 30 nights in a single room. The catch, of course, was that the room was said to be cursed. £100. I read the figure again and again, scarcely able to believe it. £100 would pay off our debts. £100 would buy my mother the medicine she needed, would keep the roof over our heads for another year, would give me time to find a more permanent solution to our troubles. £100 was a fortune to someone like me. I had answered the advertisement with trembling hands, never expecting a response. I wrote in my best hand on the last sheet of good paper we possessed, describing myself with unflinching honesty. A spinster of modest education and limited prospects. A woman with no connections and no influence. Someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. But a response came, written in elegant script on paper so fine I was afraid to touch it. The Count Dorian Blackmere requested my presence at his estate to discuss the terms of employment. I was to arrive on the 15th of October, prepared to begin my tenure that very night should I prove suitable. Suitable. I wondered what qualities made a woman suitable for sleeping in a cursed room. The journey from London to Blackmere took the better part of a day. I traveled by train first, then by hired carriage, watching as the city gave way to countryside, and the countryside grew progressively wilder and more remote. The villages became smaller and farther between. The roads became rougher. And always, the fog rolled in from the distant moors, obscuring the landscape and muffling sound until I felt as though I were traveling through a dream. The driver who took me from the final village to the manor was a taciturn man with weathered features and hands that never stopped fidgeting with the reins. He spoke only once during the entire journey, when we turned onto the private road that led to the Blackmere estate. "You are certain this is where you want to go, miss?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made my blood run cold. "That house has a dark history. No one stays there long." "I am certain," I said, though I was anything but. He shrugged and said nothing more, but I noticed that he drove faster after that, as though eager to be rid of both me and the road that led to Blackmere. The carriage deposited me at the gates and departed with unseemly haste, the driver refusing to meet my eyes as he collected his fare. The lantern on the back of the carriage cast swinging shadows as it retreated into the fog, and I watched it disappear with a feeling of finality that settled in my chest like a stone. I was alone now, alone with whatever awaited me beyond those iron gates. Blackmere Manor stood before me like something from a fever dream. Gothic spires pierced the gray sky, their tips vanishing into the low-hanging clouds. Gargoyles crouched at the corners of the roofline, their faces twisted into expressions of eternal torment. The windows were dark save for a single light burning in the eastern wing, a solitary candle flame visible through the fog like a distant star. The east room, I presumed. My room, if I was brave enough to claim it. I gathered my courage along with my single traveling case and walked through the gates. The gravel path seemed endless, winding through gardens that had been beautiful once, but now grew wild and untended. Rose bushes had become tangled masses of thorns, their blooms long since faded to brown. The hedges had lost all pretense of shape, their branches reaching toward me like grasping hands. Statues stood at intervals along the path, classical figures draped in ivy and moss, their faces worn smooth by decades of rain and neglect. Only the manor itself seemed maintained, its stone facade clean and imposing despite the general air of decay that surrounded it. The front door was painted a black so deep it seemed to absorb the dying light of evening. I climbed the steps to the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I could smell the fog here, cold and damp and vaguely sulphurous, mixed with the scent of decaying leaves and something else. Something that might have been incense, or might have been the lingering traces of a fire long since burned out. My hand trembled as I reached for the brass knocker, a lion's head with a ring clenched between its teeth. But the door opened before my knuckles could touch the metal. A butler stood before me, ancient and thin, his livery immaculate despite the obvious age of the fabric. His face was a map of wrinkles that seemed to hold more sorrow than any face had a right to contain, and his eyes, when they met mine, were rheumy and pale with what might have been cataracts or might have been something far stranger. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in those clouded eyes. Pity, perhaps, or warning. "Miss Hartley," he said. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across stone, papery and thin and devoid of warmth. "The Count is expecting you. Please follow me." I stepped into a foyer that stole my breath. Despite the neglected gardens, despite the fog and the decay and the general air of abandonment, the interior of Blackmere Manor was magnificent. A chandelier dripping with crystals cast rainbow patterns across marble floors veined with black and gold. A grand staircase swept upward toward shadows, its banisters carved with roses and thorns so intricate they seemed almost alive. Tapestries hung on the walls, depicting scenes of hunts and battles and courtly love, their colors still vibrant despite the passage of years. And portraits, dozens of portraits, lined every available surface, generations of Blackmeres staring down at me with dark eyes and unsmiling mouths. One portrait in particular caught my attention. It hung at the base of the stairs, larger than the others, in a gilt frame that gleamed in the candlelight. It depicted two young men who could only be brothers. They shared the same dark hair, thick and wavy and unfashionably long. The same sharp cheekbones, the same aristocratic bearing, the same intensity of gaze. But where one brother's expression was stern and guarded, his lips pressed into a thin line and his eyes like chips of winter ice, the other smiled with a warmth that seemed to reach through the canvas and touch my heart. I found myself stopping before it, unable to look away from that gentle smile, from the kindness in those painted eyes. "The late Viscount Alistair Blackmere," the butler said, appearing at my elbow so silently that I started, "and the current Count, his younger brother Dorian." The portrait was commissioned to celebrate Lord Alistair's engagement, 6 years past. "What happened to him?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. The advertisement had mentioned that the East Room had been the site of a family tragedy. I had assumed illness or accident, the sort of misfortune that befell even the healthiest of young men. But looking at the portrait, at the vitality that seemed to radiate from the painted figure, I found it difficult to imagine him struck down by anything so mundane. "He died," the butler said simply, "in the East Room, the night before his wedding." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty foyer. The smiling man in the portrait, frozen forever in his moment of happiness, had died in the very room where I was meant to sleep. He had gone to bed anticipating his wedding day, anticipating a future filled with love and joy, and the promise of a family of his own, and he had never woken up. I opened my mouth to ask more, to demand details and explanations and whatever else the butler could tell me. but he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing in the vast space, his back rigid with the particular dignity of old servants who have learned to guard their master's secrets. "The Count will see you in the library," he said over his shoulder. "This way, Miss Hartley." I followed him through corridors that seemed designed to confuse. Left, then right, then left again, past closed doors and shadowed alcoves, past windows that looked out on nothing but fog. The manor was silent, save for our footsteps and the occasional creak of settling wood. No servants bustled about their duties, no clocks ticked in empty rooms. It felt less like a home than a held breath, a place waiting for something to happen. Waiting, perhaps, for me. The library, when we reached it, was a revelation. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, stuffed with volumes that looked older than the manor itself. Leather spines in every color of the rainbow, from deep burgundy to forest green to the pale cream of ancient vellum. A rolling ladder stood in one corner, offering access to the highest shelves, and the scent of old paper and binding glue filled the air like perfume. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and leather furniture. And standing before the fire, his back to me, was a figure I recognized from the portrait. Count Dorian Blackmere. He turned as the butler announced me, and I felt the full force of his gaze like a physical weight. He was handsome in the way that a storm is beautiful, all sharp edges and barely contained intensity. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, brushing the collar of his black coat, and his eyes were the color of winter ice, pale gray with flecks of blue that seemed to shift and change in the firelight. He was tall and lean, his frame suggesting a strength that his elegant clothing could not quite conceal. And he looked at me the way one might look at an equation that refused to be solved, with a mixture of curiosity and frustration and something else I could not quite name. "Miss Hartley," he said. His voice was deeper than I expected, with a roughness that suggested he did not use it often. There was no warmth in it, no welcome, only a flat assessment that made me feel like a specimen pinned beneath glass. "Please sit." I sat in the chair he indicated, a wingback upholstered in green velvet, perching on its edge like a bird ready to take flight. He remained standing, studying me with those cold eyes, and I had the uncomfortable feeling of being measured and found wanting. "You understand the nature of this position," he said. It was not a question. "I believe so, my lord." I kept my voice steady despite the nerves that fluttered in my stomach. "I am to spend 30 nights in the East Room. If I complete the term, I receive £100. One corner of his mouth twitched. It might have been amusement, or it might have been contempt. "And do you know why I am willing to pay such an exorbitant sum for something so simple?" I hesitated, considering my words carefully. "The advertisement mentioned that the room is said to be cursed. Said to be." He turned back to the fire, presenting me with the rigid line of his back. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides, by servants with overactive imaginations, by villagers who traffic in gossip and superstition. "My brother died in that room, Miss Hartley. It was a tragedy, not a haunting. But the rumors have persisted for 6 years, and I have been unable to keep staff because of them." He paused, and I saw his jaw tighten. "I need someone to prove that the room is merely a room, that there is no curse, no ghost, nothing but 4 walls and a bed, and the fevered imaginings of those too ignorant to know better." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. I understood then that this was not merely about practicality or staff retention. This was personal. This was a man trying to lay his brother's memory to rest in the only way he knew how. The advertisement, the £100, the 30 nights in a cursed room. They were all part of an elaborate ritual designed to convince himself that his brother was truly gone, that there was nothing left of him but bones in a crypt and paint on a canvas. "And if I see something?" I asked quietly. "If there truly is a presence in that room?" He turned to face me again, and for just a moment I saw something crack in that icy facade. Grief, I thought. Old and deep and carefully buried beneath layers of cynicism and cold rationality. Grief that had never been properly mourned, never been allowed to run its course. "You will not," he said firmly. And there was a desperation in his voice that belied the certainty of his words. "Because there is nothing to see. My brother is dead, Miss Hartley. Dead and buried in the family crypt. Whatever walks in the East Room is nothing but guilt and grief and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless tragedy." I should have been frightened by his intensity, by the barely leashed emotion in his voice. Instead, I felt an unexpected wave of compassion. This was a man in pain, a man who had lost his brother and been unable to escape the shadow of that loss. The cursed room was not the east wing of Blackmere Manor. It was the prison of his own making, built from guilt and grief and the weight of 6 years of unanswered questions. "I will do it," I said. His eyes narrowed. "You have not heard the terms. I do not need to hear them, my lord. £100, 30 nights. I accept." For a long moment, he simply stared at me. I met his gaze without flinching, letting him see my determination, my desperation, my absolute refusal to back down. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it. Something shifted in his expression, some subtle relaxation of the tension in his jaw and shoulders. Not quite approval, but something close to it. "Very well," he said. He moved to his desk, a massive mahogany piece covered in papers and books, and retrieved a document from one of the drawers. He placed it before me along with a pen, the nib gleaming wetly with fresh ink. "The terms are simple. You will sleep in the East Room every night from dusk to dawn. You will not leave the room during those hours, regardless of what you think you see or hear. You will keep a journal of your experiences, which you will submit to me at the end of your tenure, and you will speak to no one about what occurs in that room until the 30 days have passed." I took the pen and signed my name without hesitation. The ink seemed to glow wetly in the firelight, dark as blood against the cream-colored paper. I had the strange sense that I was signing more than a contract, that I was making a promise I did not yet understand. "The butler will show you to your room," Count Blackmere said. He did not look at me as he spoke, his attention already returned to the fire. "Dinner will be brought to you there. I trust you will find everything you need." It was a dismissal, clear and cold. I rose from my chair and made my way to the door, my skirts rustling against the Persian rugs. But something made me pause on the threshold. Perhaps it was the slump of his shoulders, the solitary figure he cut against the flames. Perhaps it was the memory of his brother's smile, frozen forever in paint and canvas. "My lord," I said. He did not turn, but I saw his shoulders stiffen. "I am sorry for your loss." He said nothing. I left him standing before the fire, a solitary figure silhouetted against the flames, and followed the butler up the grand staircase toward my destiny. The East Room was at the end of a long corridor, set apart from the rest of the manor like a quarantined patient. The walls here were bare of portraits, bare of tapestries, bare of anything that might suggest human habitation. Only the occasional wall sconce broke the monotony, their candles unlit, their brass fixtures tarnished with neglect. The butler's footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and my own seemed to whisper in response, a counterpoint rhythm that set my nerves on edge. He unlocked the door with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, and I noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he worked the lock. The key itself was old, its metal worn smooth by generations of use, and it turned in the lock with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent corridor. The room itself was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, its curtains a deep burgundy that looked almost black in the dim light. The posts were carved with intricate designs, flowers and vines, and something else, something that might have been faces if I looked closely enough. But I found myself unwilling to look too closely. A vanity stood against one wall, its mirror clouded with age, its surface covered with a fine layer of dust. A writing desk occupied the space beneath a tall window that looked out over the wild gardens, its chair pushed neatly into place as though waiting for someone to sit down and write. A fire had been laid in the fireplace, but not lit, and the room held a chill that seemed to seep into my bones despite my traveling cloak. But it was not the furnishings that captured my attention. It was the feeling of the room itself. The moment I stepped across the threshold, I felt as though I had walked into a memory. The air was heavy with something I could not name, something that pressed against my skin and whispered against my ears just below the threshold of hearing. It was not menacing exactly. It was more like the feeling of walking into a church or standing at the edge of a grave, a feeling of presence, of weight, of something waiting just beyond the edge of perception. "Shall I light the fire, miss?" the butler asked. I shook my head, still trying to understand the sensation that had settled over me like a second skin. It was not fear, exactly. It was more like recognition, as though I had been in this room before, though I knew that was impossible. As though something in this room had been waiting for me and had recognized me the moment I crossed the threshold. "I will manage, thank you." I forced a smile I did not feel. "I am sure I will be quite comfortable." The butler looked at me with those sorrowful eyes, and for a moment I thought he would speak. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But whatever he had been about to say died on his lips. He simply nodded, handed me the key, and retreated into the corridor. "Dinner will be brought shortly," he said as he closed the door. "And miss?" He paused, his weathered face appearing one last time through the narrowing gap. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that some souls are not at rest because they are not ready to be." The door clicked shut before I could respond. I stood in the center of the cursed room, alone with the silence and the shadows and the inexplicable feeling that I was not alone at all. I stood for a long moment after the door closed, listening to the butler's footsteps fade into silence. The weight of his parting words pressed against me. Some souls are not at rest because they are not ready to be. What did that mean? Was it a warning? A confession? Or simply the cryptic observation of an old man who had seen too much in his years of service to this haunted family? I moved to the window and looked out over the gardens. The fog had thickened with the coming of night, and I could see nothing but gray. It was as though the world beyond this room had ceased to exist, as though I had stepped out of time itself and into some liminal space between what was and what might be. The glass was cold beneath my fingertips, and I could feel the chill seeping through, carrying with it the scent of decay and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of something that might have been a voice. I pulled my hand away and turned back to the room. I busied myself with unpacking my meager belongings, trying to shake the strange atmosphere that clung to the room like cobwebs. My traveling case held little of value. 2 changes of clothes, practical dresses in dark colors that would not show stains or wear, a nightgown of white cotton, worn thin from years of washing, but still serviceable, a small collection of books that had survived the sale of our possessions, volumes of poetry and philosophy that I could not bear to part with even in our darkest hours, a hairbrush with a silver handle, tarnished now but still elegant, that had belonged to my grandmother, and a photograph of my parents on their wedding day, sepia-toned and precious, the only image I had of my father's face. I placed the photograph on the vanity, letting my mother's gentle smile give me courage. She had been beautiful then, before illness and grief had stolen the light from her eyes. And my father had looked at her with such adoration, such pure and absolute love, that even now, years after his death, I felt tears prick at my eyes when I looked at it. Dinner arrived on a silver tray, brought by a young maid whose eyes were wide with terror. She was barely more than a girl, perhaps 16 or 17, with a mass of red curls barely contained beneath her cap and a scattering of freckles across her pale cheeks. She set the tray on the desk without meeting my eyes, her hands shaking so badly that the dishes rattled against each other. "Is there anything else you need, miss?" she asked, and her voice trembled as badly as her hands. "No, thank you." I tried to smile reassuringly, but she was already backing toward the door. "Wait. What is your name?" She paused, surprised perhaps that I had bothered to ask. "Molly, miss. Molly Brennan." "Thank you, Molly. I am sure I will see you tomorrow." Her expression suggested she was not at all sure of that, but she bobbed a curtsy and fled without another word, her footsteps echoing down the corridor in rapid retreat. I heard the distant slam of a door, and then silence descended once more. I ate without tasting, my attention fixed on the window and the darkness gathering beyond the glass. The fog had thickened as evening fell, pressing against the window like something alive, something hungry. I could see nothing of the gardens below, nothing of the world beyond this room. I might as well have been floating in a void, alone and untethered, cut off from everything I had ever known. The meal itself was simple but well prepared. Roasted chicken with herbs, potatoes swimming in butter, a salad of winter greens. There was wine as well, a deep burgundy that matched the curtains of the bed, and I found myself drinking more than I intended. The alcohol warmed my blood and dulled the edge of my anxiety, making the shadows in the corners of the room seem less threatening, more ordinary. I thought of my mother as I ate, wondering if she was thinking of me. I had left her in the care of a neighbor, a kindly widow who had agreed to look in on her each day. But I worried nonetheless. My mother had become so fragile in the years since my father's death, so dependent on my presence. The thought of her alone in our cold, empty house made my heart ache with guilt. But this was for her. Everything I did was for her. the £100 would buy her medicine, buy her warmth, buy her another year of life. If I had to spend 30 nights in a haunted room to earn it, then that was what I would do. When the last light faded from the sky, I lit a single candle and prepared for bed. The sheets were cool and crisp, scented faintly with lavender and something else, something that might have been sandalwood or might have been nothing more than the dust of years. I lay in the center of the massive bed, feeling small and exposed, watching the candle flame dance in some unfelt draft. The burgundy curtains hung motionless around me, their heavy velvet blocking the faint light from the window. The silence of the room pressed against my ears, thick and expectant. I found myself straining to hear something, anything. But there was only the distant settling of the old house and the whisper of wind against the window pane. I tried to read, but the words blurred before my eyes. I tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. I lay there in the darkness, watching the candle burn lower and lower, and waited for something I could not name. I do not know when I fell asleep. I know only that I woke in perfect darkness, the candle having burned itself out, with the absolute certainty that someone was in the room with me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound would shatter the fragile membrane between the possible and the impossible. The darkness was complete, the kind of darkness that existed only in old houses, in rooms untouched by gaslight or street lamps. I could see nothing, not the canopy of the bed above me, not the window across the room, not my own hands lying motionless on the coverlet. Nothing but blackness, absolute and impenetrable. But I could feel. There was a presence at the foot of the bed. I could not explain how I knew this. I simply did, with a certainty that transcended the physical senses. Something stood there in the darkness, watching me with an attention that was almost physical in its intensity. I waited for fear to overwhelm me, for panic to send me screaming into the corridor. But the fear did not come. Instead, I felt something entirely unexpected. Sadness. It rolled over me like a wave, a grief so profound and so ancient that it brought tears to my eyes. This was not the malevolent haunting the villagers whispered about. This was not the curse the servants feared. This was something else entirely, something lost and lonely and desperately, achingly sad. I found my voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" The darkness shifted. I felt rather than saw movement, a subtle displacement of air as something drew closer to the bed. The sadness intensified, pressing against me like a physical weight, and with it came something else. A kind of wonder. A recognition that mirrored my own. And then, soft as moth wings against glass, I heard it. My bride. The words were not spoken aloud. They seemed to form directly in my mind, gentle and wondering and suffused with that same overwhelming sadness. My bride, my bride. I have waited so long. I sat up in bed, my hands clutching the blankets, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the presence could hear it. "I am not your bride," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "I do not know who you think I am, but you are mistaken." The presence withdrew slightly, and I felt its confusion like a cold wind against my skin. It was not angry. It was not threatening. It was simply puzzled, like a child who has been told that the sky is not blue, that water is not wet, that the fundamental truths of existence are nothing but lies. "Then who are you?" it asked, and there was something almost plaintive in the question. "Why are you in my room?" Your room. The pieces began to fall into place in my mind, clicking together like the tumblers of a lock. The portrait in the foyer. The butler's sorrowful eyes. The brother who had died the night before his wedding. You are Alistair Blackmere. The silence that followed was profound. I could feel the presence wrestling with itself, struggling to understand, struggling to remember. There was a sense of reaching, of grasping for something just beyond the edge of perception. And then, like a sigh that encompassed all the sorrow in the world, the answer came. Yes, no, I was. I do not remember. You died, I said gently, speaking to the darkness as though it were a frightened child. In this room, 6 years ago. Again that terrible silence. I could feel the presence processing my words, trying to make sense of them, trying to reconcile them with whatever fragmented memories it possessed. And then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. I remember now, the presence said. I remember the darkness. I remember falling. I remember calling for help that never came. And I remember her, my Rosalind. She was meant to be my bride. I felt tears slip down my cheeks, though whether they were my own or somehow his, I could not say. The sadness that emanated from him was overwhelming, a grief so profound it seemed to transcend the boundaries between the living and the dead. He had loved this ghost. He had loved with all his heart, and that love had been cut short by death. What happened to you? I asked. I do not know. I only know that I woke in darkness, and I have been in darkness ever since. I wait for her, but she never comes. No one comes. Until you. The presence drew closer again, and I felt the faintest brush of something against my hair. It was cold, but not unpleasantly so. Like a winter breeze carrying the memory of spring, like the touch of water on a hot day. Gentle, curious, wondering. You are not Rosalind, the presence said, but you are here. You are not afraid. I am a little afraid, I admitted. The presence seemed to consider this. There was a thoughtfulness to it, a careful weighing of words and emotions that felt remarkably human despite its otherworldly nature. But you did not run, it said finally. No, I did not run. Why? I thought about the question, searching for an answer that would make sense to both of us. Because you are sad, I said finally, and because no one should have to be alone in the darkness forever. The presence was silent for so long that I thought perhaps it had gone. The sadness faded, replaced by something else, something that felt almost like hope. And then, soft and wondering, I heard the words again. My bride. I am not your bride, I repeated. But this time, there was no fear in my voice, only a strange, tender patience that I had not known I possessed. I know, the presence said, but you are the first warmth I have felt since the darkness took me. May I stay near you? I will not harm you. I only wish to remember what it felt like to be alive. My heart ached with a compassion I had not known I possessed. Yes, I said, you may stay. And so began my strange companionship with the ghost of Alistair Blackmere. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. I would wake at dawn, the presence having retreated with the coming of the light, and spend my daylight hours exploring the manor or reading in the library. The house was vast and labyrinthine, full of rooms that seemed to have been forgotten for decades and corridors that led to unexpected places. I found a music room with a grand piano covered in dust, its keys yellowed with age, but still capable of producing beautiful sound. I sat at it one afternoon and played a simple melody, a lullaby my mother had sung to me as a child. The notes echoed through the empty room, filling it with something that felt almost like life. I wondered if Alistair had played this piano, if his fingers had touched these same keys. The thought made me both happy and sad. I found a conservatory filled with dead plants, their skeletal forms reaching toward the glass ceiling like supplicants. Once, this room must have been beautiful, filled with exotic flowers and the perfume of 1,000 blossoms. Now it was a tomb, a monument to neglect and abandonment. I spent an afternoon clearing away the worst of the debris, though I did not know why. Perhaps I simply needed to feel useful. Perhaps I wanted to leave some mark on this place, some evidence that I had been here. I found a gallery of portraits that traced the Blackmere lineage back centuries, dark-eyed aristocrats staring down at me with expressions that ranged from haughty to kind to something that looked remarkably like fear. I studied each face, searching for traces of Alistair in his ancestors. I found it in the curve of a jaw, the set of a brow, the gentle warmth of a smile that appeared only rarely among these stern and proper lords. There was one portrait that drew me back again and again. It depicted a woman in a white gown, her dark hair piled atop her head in an elaborate style, her eyes the color of spring violets. She was beautiful in the way that porcelain dolls are beautiful, perfect and cold, and somehow empty. A small plaque beneath the frame identified her as Lady Rosalind Ashworth. This, then, was the woman Alistair had loved, the woman who had betrayed him. I stared at her painted face for a long time, searching for some sign of the cruelty she had hidden beneath her beauty. But the portrait revealed nothing. It was simply a face, lovely and meaningless, a mask that concealed whatever darkness lurked beneath. Through it all, I was aware of Count Dorian's watchful gaze. He kept his distance, speaking to me only when necessary, but I often caught him studying me from across the room with an expression I could not decipher. Sometimes I thought I saw curiosity in his eyes. Sometimes I thought I saw fear. And sometimes, in unguarded moments, I thought I saw something that looked almost like hope. At night, I would return to the East Room and the gentle presence that awaited me there. Alistair, as I came to know him, was nothing like the malevolent spirit of the servant's whispers. He was confused and sad and desperately lonely, a soul suspended between worlds, unable to move forward or backward. He could not remember the circumstances of his death, only the darkness that had followed. And he clung to me like a drowning man clings to driftwood, not with malice, but with the simple, profound need for human connection. We talked for hours, though talking was not quite the right word. His voice came to me in that strange way, not through my ears, but through some deeper channel, as though he were speaking directly to my heart. And my responses were as much feeling as words, emotions shaped into meaning and projected into the darkness between us. It was an intimate form of communication, more intimate in some ways than any conversation I had ever had with a living person. There was no room for pretense or deception, only truth, raw and unvarnished. I told him about my life, about my mother's illness and my father's death, and the slow descent into poverty that had brought me to his door. I told him about the advertisement in the newspaper, about my desperation and my fear and my absolute determination to succeed. I told him about my dreams, the ones I had abandoned long ago in the face of practical necessity, and about the person I had wanted to be before life had stripped away everything but survival. He listened with a patience that transcended time. He asked questions, gentle questions that showed he was truly listening, truly interested in the woman I was beneath the surface. And when I had exhausted my stories, when I had laid bare every corner of my soul, he shared what fragments he could remember of his own. There were nights when he spoke of his childhood, of summer days spent exploring the grounds of Blackmere, of winter evenings before the library fire with his brother. He and Dorian had been close as children, he told me. They had shared everything, toys and books and secrets and dreams. They had built forts in the gardens and staged elaborate battles with tin soldiers. They had raced their ponies across the moors and swum in the lake until their lips turned blue. But something had changed as they grew older. The weight of expectation had settled upon Alistair's shoulders, the knowledge that he would one day be Earl, that he would inherit the title and the estate and all the responsibilities that came with them. Dorian, freed from such burdens, had pursued his own interests with an abandon that Alistair could not help but envy. And somewhere along the way, the closeness they had shared as boys had fractured into something more complicated. I did not realize until too late that we had become strangers, Alistair told me one night. I was so consumed with duty, with becoming the man my father wanted me to be, that I forgot to be the brother Dorian needed. I regret that more than almost anything. Even more than Rosalind? I asked. He was silent for a long moment. Even more than her, he said finally. I loved her, or thought I did, but she was an illusion. Dorian was real, and I let him slip away. The sadness in his voice was overwhelming, and I found myself reaching out into the darkness, wishing I could somehow offer comfort to this lost and lonely soul. He had been happy once, the eldest son of a proud family, heir to the title and the estate. He had grown up in these halls, had played in these gardens, had learned to ride and hunt and dance and play the piano in that dusty music room I had discovered. He had been educated at Oxford, had traveled through Europe, had experienced all the privileges and pleasures that came with his station. But he had never been content with mere privilege. He had wanted something more, something real. He had found it in Rosalind. She was a lady of good breeding but modest fortune, the daughter of a baron with more debts than assets. They had met at a ball in London, and from the moment he saw her, he knew. She was the one. The woman he had been waiting for his entire life. She was beautiful, yes, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes like spring violets. But it was not her beauty that captivated him. It was her spirit, her wit, the way she laughed without restraint and spoke her mind without apology. She was everything he had never known he wanted, and he fell in love with her utterly and completely. Their engagement had been announced at midsummer, and they were to be married in autumn. The arrangements were made, the invitation sent, the gown commissioned and fitted. He remembered the joy of those days, the anticipation of a future bright with promise. They would have a home of their own, a family, a life built on love and mutual respect. Everything he had ever dreamed of was within reach. And then, the night before the wedding, something had happened in the East Room, something he could not remember no matter how hard he tried. He had fallen into darkness and never emerged. What happened to Rosalind? I asked on the 5th night. The presence was silent for a long moment. I could feel his struggle, the painful reaching for memories that slipped away like water through fingers. I do not know, he said finally, and the words were heavy with grief. I called for her. I called and called, but she never came. No one came. I thought of the portrait in the foyer, of the warmth in his painted smile, and felt a surge of anger toward whoever had left him here in this twilight state, alone and forgotten. Someone should have come. Someone should have noticed that a man was dying, that a spirit was trapped. Someone should have cared enough to set him free. I will find out, I promised. I will discover what happened to you. Why? His confusion was genuine. Why would you do this for me? Because everyone deserves to know the truth of their own story, I said, even the dead. The following day, I began my investigation. The servants were reluctant to speak at first, their eyes darting nervously whenever I mentioned the East Room or its former occupant. They had been trained to silence, I realized, trained to pretend that nothing was wrong, that the manor was not haunted, that the young master had simply died of natural causes. But I was patient and persistent, and eventually, one by one, they began to open up. The housekeeper was the most forthcoming. Mrs. Blackwood was a stern woman with iron-gray hair and a spine like a poker, but beneath her forbidding exterior, I sensed a weight of knowledge, of secrets that pressed against her from within. She agreed to meet me in the servants' hall after dinner, when the other staff had retired, and she spoke to me in hushed tones that suggested she feared being overheard even in the empty room. "We found him in the morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The young master. He was lying on the floor beside the bed, still in his evening clothes. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped. A tragedy, but not unheard of in young men. Sometimes the heart just fails." "And Lady Rosalind?" I asked. Mrs. Blackwood's expression darkened. A shadow passed over her face, and her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She left that very day, would not even stay for the funeral. Some said she was too grief-stricken to bear it. Others said, "But no, I should not repeat gossip. Please," I urged. "It may be important." The housekeeper sighed. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and I saw them tremble slightly. Others said she was relieved, she admitted finally, that she had never truly loved the young master, only his title and his fortune. That she had been conducting an affair with another gentleman and saw the young master's death as her escape. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty servants' hall. Was there any truth to these rumors? "I do not know, miss, but I do know that Lord Dorian believed them. He and his brother had been close as children, but had grown apart in the years before the young master's death. There was some quarrel between them, and after, well, Lord Dorian has not been the same since. He blames himself, though I cannot imagine why. He was not even in the house that night. Where was he?" Mrs. Blackwood hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward the door, as though checking for eavesdroppers. "That, miss, is not my story to tell." I thanked her for her time and spent the remainder of the afternoon in the library, searching for any record of the events surrounding Alistair's death. The library became my sanctuary during those days, its dusty shelves and leather-bound volumes offering both information and refuge. I started with the family histories, thick tomes that traced the Blackmere lineage back to the Norman conquest. I read of battles and betrayals, of marriages of convenience and love matches that defied convention. I read of fortunes won and lost, of estates expanded and diminished, of a family that had endured for centuries through determination and ruthlessness in equal measure. Then I turned to the society papers, the gossip columns and social registers that documented the comings and goings of the aristocracy. I found references to Alistair here and there, mentions of balls he had attended and dinners he had hosted. He seemed to have been well-liked, popular among his peers, respected by his elders. There were no hints of scandal, no whispers of impropriety. He had been, by all accounts, exactly what a future earl should be. I found the announcement of the engagement in a society paper, dated June of 1883. The wedding announcement, which should have appeared in September, was conspicuously absent. In its place was a brief notice of Lord Alistair's passing, couched in the vague language of sudden illness. "You are looking for something." The voice startled me. I turned to find Count Dorian standing in the doorway of the library, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He was dressed more casually than I had seen him before, his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. The informality made him seem more human somehow, more approachable. But his expression was anything but approachable. "I was reading," I said, which was not entirely a lie. He crossed the room in long strides, stopping before the table where I had spread my findings. He looked down at the society papers, at the circled announcement, and his jaw tightened. "You are investigating my brother's death," he said flatly. "I saw no point in denying it. Yes. Why? Because no one else has." I met his gaze without flinching. "Something happened in that room 6 years ago, my lord. Something that has kept your brother trapped between worlds. Do you not want to know what it was?" His expression flickered, pain breaking through the ice for just a moment. I saw the boy he had been, the brother who had loved and lost and been unable to let go. And I saw the man he had become, hardened by grief and guilt and the weight of unanswered questions. "My brother is dead, Miss Hartley," he said. "Knowing why will not bring him back. Perhaps not, but it might set him free." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Count Dorian turned away, walking to the window to stare out at the fog-shrouded gardens. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, insubstantial, a pale echo of the man who stood before me. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "You have seen him," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, and he speaks to you, in a manner of speaking." He was silent for a long moment. I watched his reflection, watched the play of emotions across his features. Pain, guilt, jealousy, and something else, something that looked almost like longing. "I tried for years to reach him," he said finally. "I sat in that room night after night, calling his name, begging him to appear. He never did. Not once. And now you, a stranger, walk through my door, and he speaks to you as though you were old friends." He turned to face me, and I saw the raw anguish in his eyes. "Why you?" "I do not know," I admitted, perhaps because I came without expectations, without guilt or grief or history. I was simply there, and he was simply lonely. Lonely. The word seemed to strike him like a blow. He moved toward me, close enough that I could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, close enough that I could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body despite the chill that seemed to follow him everywhere. "You think me cruel," he said, "cold and heartless and indifferent to my brother's fate." "I think you are in pain," I said softly. "I think you have been in pain for 6 years and have not allowed yourself to feel it." His laugh was bitter, a harsh sound in the quiet library. "You know nothing of my pain. Then tell me." I reached out, my fingers brushing his sleeve in a gesture of comfort. "Help me understand." For a moment, I thought he would pull away. His entire body was rigid with the effort of containing whatever storm raged within him. But then, like a dam breaking, the words began to pour out. "I was in love with her," he said, "with Rosalind. Before she was my brother's betrothed, she was mine. We had an understanding, or so I believed. We had met at a ball, had danced together, had walked in the moonlight and spoken of poetry and art and all the things that matter to young hearts. I thought she felt as I did. I thought we had a future. I said nothing, sensing there was more. But my brother was the heir, and I was merely the spare. When our father discovered my attachment, he forbade the match. He arranged for Alistair to court her instead, and he spat the word like poison, she accepted without hesitation. She did not even have the decency to refuse. She simply moved from my arm to his as though I had never existed. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. I wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but I held myself still. I confronted her the night before the wedding, Dorian continued. I told her I knew her heart belonged to me, that the marriage was a travesty, that we could still run away together. She laughed in my face. She said she had never loved me, that I had been nothing more than a diversion until a better prospect came along. She said my brother was twice the man I would ever be. And you believed her? What else could I believe? He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. I left that night. I rode to London and drank myself into oblivion. I could not bear to be in the house, could not bear to watch her walk down the aisle to my brother, could not bear the thought of them together. And while I was drowning my sorrows in whiskey and self-pity, he was dying, alone, in that room. He turned away, his shoulders shaking. I was a coward, he said. I abandoned my brother when he needed me most, and I have spent every day since trying to atone for that sin. I crossed the distance between us and placed my hand on his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. You did not kill your brother, I said firmly. Whatever happened that night, you were not responsible. You do not know that. I know that Alistair does not blame you. He has never spoken of you with anything but love. He is confused and lost and desperately sad, but not because of you, because of whatever happened in that room that he cannot remember. Dorian turned to face me, and I saw something shift in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or the first fragile stirrings of it. Can you truly help him? He asked. I can try. He studied my face for a long moment, as though searching for something. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. Slowly, he nodded. There is a letter, he said, in my father's study. I found it after his death, hidden in a locked drawer. I never understood what it meant, but perhaps you will. Show me. He led me through the labyrinthine corridors of the manor to a room I had not yet discovered. The late Earl's study was preserved exactly as he had left it. Dust sheets draped over the furniture, the air thick with the smell of old paper and forgotten time. Motes of dust danced in the weak light filtering through grimy windows, and the silence here was heavier than anywhere else in the house. It felt like a tomb. Dorian moved to the desk and retrieved a small key from his pocket, unlocking a drawer that had clearly not been opened in years. The lock protested, rust flaking away beneath his fingers, but eventually it yielded. The letter was yellowed with age, its edges soft from handling. Dorian handed it to me without a word, and I read it by the dim light filtering through the grimy window. The contents chilled me to the bone. The letter was from Rosalind, addressed to the late Earl. In it, she detailed a plot to ensure Alistair would not survive to see his wedding night. She had never loved him, she wrote. She had only agreed to the match because of his fortune and title. But she had discovered that the Earl intended to disinherit Alistair in favor of Dorian, whom he considered more capable of managing the estate. If Alistair lived to marry her, she would be left with nothing. But if he died before the wedding, she would be free to pursue Dorian instead, along with his newly inherited fortune. The letter did not specify how she intended to accomplish this goal, but it made clear that she had an accomplice, someone inside the house who had agreed to help her in exchange for a share of the wealth. She killed him, I breathed. She and someone in this house murdered Alistair. Dorian's face was ashen. My father found this letter the morning after Alistair's death. He confronted Rosalind, and she fled before he could have her arrested. He spent the remaining years of his life trying to discover the identity of her accomplice, but he died without finding the answer. And you never told anyone? Who would believe me? The letter proves nothing. There was no evidence of foul play. The doctor ruled it a natural death, and Rosalind disappeared without a trace. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. I have been searching for 6 years, Miss Hartley, 6 years, and I am no closer to the truth than I was the night my brother died. I looked down at the letter in my hands, my mind racing. The answer is in this house, I said slowly. Whoever helped Rosalind is still here. They have to be. Dorian shook his head. The staff has changed entirely since then. My father dismissed everyone who had been present that night, save for Mrs. Blackwood, who was visiting her sister at the time. The butler, the maids, the footmen, all replaced. Then perhaps we are looking for the wrong thing, I said. Perhaps the answer is not in who is here now, but in who was here then. Do you have records? Employment records from 6 years ago? My father kept meticulous accounts. They should be in the household ledgers. Fetch them. I squared my shoulders, feeling a new determination take hold. We are going to find out who killed your brother, my lord, and when we do, we are going to set him free. The household ledgers revealed what I had suspected. Among the servants dismissed after Alistair's death was a lady's maid named Sarah Marsh, who had served Rosalind during her visits to the manor. The ledger noted that she had been dismissed for theft, though the nature of the stolen items was not specified. More importantly, it listed her next of kin as her sister, a woman named Margaret Marsh, who had married a man named Thomas Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood, I said, looking up from the ledger in shock. The housekeeper. Dorian's expression hardened. Mrs. Blackwood has been with this household for 20 years. She came highly recommended from a family in Devonshire. After the original Mrs. Blackwood died, I assume. He was silent, processing the implications. I need to speak to her, I said, and I need to do it before she suspects what we have discovered. I found the housekeeper in the kitchen, overseeing the preparation of dinner. She looked up as I entered, her expression pleasant but guarded. Miss Hartley, is there something you need? I smiled, keeping my voice casual. I was hoping you might tell me more about the manor's history. You mentioned you have been here for 20 years. That is quite a long time. 23 years this Christmas, she said with evident pride. I came as a scullery maid and worked my way up. That is impressive. I moved closer, keeping my body language relaxed and unthreatening. I confess I am curious about your family. Do you have any sisters? The change in her demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Her hand stilled on the rolling pin she had been wielding, and something flickered in her eyes. A sister? Why do you ask? I found some old employment records, I said, watching her carefully. There was a maid named Sarah Marsh who worked here before you. The records show she was your sister. The color drained from Mrs. Blackwood's face. She set down the rolling pin with deliberate care and turned to face me fully. Sarah died many years ago, she said. I do not see what relevance she has to anything. She was Lady Rosalind's maid, I continued, and she was dismissed for theft the day after Lord Alistair's death. That seems like quite a coincidence. You should be careful, Miss Hartley. Mrs. Blackwood's voice had gone cold. Asking questions about things that do not concern you can be dangerous. I think it does concern me, I said. I think your sister helped Lady Rosalind murder Lord Alistair, and I think you know exactly what happened that night. For a long moment, the housekeeper simply stared at me. Then, to my surprise, her face crumpled, and she began to weep. It was not supposed to happen like that, she sobbed. Sarah only meant to give him a sleeping draught. Lady Rosalind said it would make him sick enough to postpone the wedding, nothing more. But something went wrong. The dose was too strong, or his heart was too weak. When Sarah went to check on him in the morning, he was already cold. I felt sick. And Rosalind? She fled the moment she heard, took all the jewelry she could carry and disappeared. Sarah panicked. She tried to make it look like a natural death, and when the doctor ruled it so, we thought it was over. But the old Earl found the letter. He dismissed Sarah and threatened to have her hanged if she ever spoke of what had happened. She died of consumption 3 years later, still carrying the guilt. And you, I said quietly. You knew all of this and said nothing. Mrs. Blackwood looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. What good would it have done? The young master was dead. Nothing could bring him back, and Sarah was my sister. I could not betray her, even after her death. I understood her reasoning, even as I condemned it. But there was still one question that needed answering. Where is Rosalind now? The housekeeper shook her head. I do not know. She vanished that morning and was never heard from again. Some say she fled to the continent. Others say she changed her name and married a wealthy merchant in Manchester. But I have heard nothing of her in 6 years. I left the kitchen with a heavy heart. We had our answer, or at least part of it. Alistair had been murdered, not by malice, but by carelessness and greed. A sleeping draft intended to postpone a wedding had stopped his heart instead. His death was senseless and preventable, a tragedy born of petty scheming and thoughtless cruelty. But knowing the truth was not enough. Alistair was still trapped in the East Room, still waiting for a peace that would not come. I needed to find a way to free him, and I did not know how. That night, I told him everything. I lay in the darkness of the East Room, feeling his presence beside me, and recounted what I had discovered. I did not soften the truth or spare him the painful details. He deserved to know what had happened to him, even if the knowing brought him pain. When I finished, the silence was profound. I waited, my heart aching, for his response. She never loved me, he said finally, and the words were suffused with a sorrow that seemed to encompass the entire universe. I gave her my heart, and she used it to destroy me. I am sorry, I whispered. I am so sorry. Do not be. His presence drew closer, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. You have given me something far more precious than anything she ever could. You have given me the truth, but it changes nothing. You are still trapped here, still alone. I am not alone, he said softly. You are here. I felt tears slip down my cheeks. I cannot stay forever. My time here will end in a few weeks, and I will have to leave. I know. The sadness in his voice was tempered now by something else, something that might have been acceptance. But I have had these nights with you, these conversations, this connection. It is more than I have had in 6 years, more than I ever expected to have again. There must be a way to free you, I insisted. Some ritual or ceremony or prayer, something that can break the chains that bind you to this room. Perhaps, he said, or perhaps I am meant to be here. Perhaps this is my penance for loving someone unworthy of my love. No, I sat up in bed, my voice fierce. You do not deserve this. You were the victim, not the perpetrator. You have every right to peace. The presence was silent for a long moment. Then, gently, he asked, Why do you care so much? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Why did I care? I had known this spirit for less than 2 weeks. He was dead, intangible, a voice in the darkness with no face and no form. And yet, I felt a connection to him that defied explanation. A bond that had nothing to do with obligation or pity or the terms of my employment. Because you deserve better, I said finally. Because you were kind and gentle and full of love, and you deserved a life, not an eternity of darkness. Because I hesitated, my voice dropping to barely more than a breath, because I think I might be falling in love with a ghost. The admission hung in the air between us, impossible and undeniable. I had said it, and I could not take it back. I had fallen in love with a man who had been dead for 6 years, a spirit who existed only in shadows and whispers, and the absurdity of it did not diminish its truth in the slightest. Vivian, he said, and it was the first time he had used my name. The sound of it in his voice, tender and wondering, sent a shiver through my entire body. I know it is foolish, I said quickly. I know it is impossible. I know there is no future for us, no life we can build together, but I cannot help what I feel. I cannot pretend that these nights with you have not changed me, that you have not become something precious to me, and I cannot bear the thought of leaving you here, alone in the darkness, for all eternity. You are not foolish, he said. You are the bravest woman I have ever known, the most compassionate, the most beautiful. You cannot even see me, I protested weakly. I do not need to see you to know your beauty. It shines from within. It illuminates the darkness of this room like 1,000 candles. I felt his presence move closer, and something cold brushed against my cheek like a kiss made of winter wind. I have loved you since the moment you did not run, he said. I will love you until the last star burns out and the universe falls silent. But I cannot ask you to waste your life on a love that can never be fulfilled. Perhaps it can be, I said, and a wild idea began to form in my mind. Perhaps there is a way. The next morning, I sought out Count Dorian in the library. He looked up as I entered, and I saw concern in his eyes. You have been weeping, he said. What has happened? I told him everything. About my conversations with Alistair, about the connection that had formed between us, about the impossible love that had taken root in my heart. I expected him to think me mad. I expected disgust or disbelief or dismissal. Instead, he listened in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each word. When I finished, he rose from his chair and crossed to the window, staring out at the gray morning light. You love my brother, he said finally. Yes. And he loves you. Yes. He was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, And I love you. The words struck me like a physical blow. I stared at his back, unable to speak, unable to think. I have loved you since the day you signed that contract, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. I have watched you move through this house like a ray of light in eternal darkness. I have seen your compassion, your courage, your determination to right a wrong that was not yours to right. And I have fallen in love with you, hopelessly and helplessly, knowing that you would never feel the same. My lord, I began. Dorian. He turned to face me, and I saw the pain in his eyes. If you are going to break my heart, at least call me by my name. Dorian. I rose from my chair and crossed to stand before him. I do not wish to break your heart. I care for you deeply. But Alistair is dead. His voice cracked on the word. He is a ghost, Vivian, a memory. Whatever you feel for him, it cannot lead anywhere. He cannot hold you, cannot marry you, cannot give you a life. I know. Tears were streaming down my face now. I know all of this, but I cannot change what I feel, and I cannot abandon him. Dorian stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly, his expression softened. You truly love him, he said. Yes. Then I will help you. I blinked. What? If there is a way to free my brother, to give him peace, I will help you find it. He reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. I have spent 6 years hating myself for failing him. Let me make amends now. Let me help you set him free, even if it means losing me. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. I have already lost you, Vivian. I lost you to a ghost. The least I can do is ensure that your sacrifice is not in vain. We spent the following days in research. Dorian retrieved every book on spiritualism and the supernatural that the Blackmere Library contained, and I devoured them voraciously, searching for any reference to spirits bound to specific locations and the rituals that might release them. Most of the accounts were useless, fanciful tales of seances and crystal balls and fraudulent mediums. But one volume, an obscure treatise on folklore and legend, contained a passage that made my heart race. It spoke of spirits trapped in the mortal realm by unfinished business, by grief or guilt or love unexpressed. These spirits, the author argued, were not bound by supernatural chains, but by their own inability to let go. They lingered because they could not accept the truth of their deaths, could not release their attachments to the living world. The only way to free such a spirit, the treatise claimed, was to help it find closure, to give it whatever it needed to accept its fate and move on. For some spirits, this meant bringing their killers to justice. For others, it meant reconciling with loved ones. And for still others, it meant experiencing the joy they had been denied in life. I read the passage aloud to Dorian, and we stared at each other in the flickering candlelight. He was meant to be married, I said slowly. He was in love, looking forward to a future that was stolen from him. What if that is what binds him, the wedding he never had? You think he needs to be married to find peace? Dorian's voice was skeptical, but not dismissive. I think he needs to experience the love he was denied, to know that he was worthy of it, that someone could love him truly and completely, not for his title or his fortune, but for himself. And you want to give him that? Yes. I met Dorian's gaze steadily. I want to marry him. The silence that followed was deafening. You are serious, Dorian said finally. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. He is a ghost, Vivian, a spirit. How do you propose to exchange vows with something you cannot see or touch? I do not know, I admitted. But I have to try. If there is even a chance that it could free him, I have to try. Dorian studied my face for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Very well, he said. If you are determined to marry my brother's ghost, then I will be your witness. The ceremony took place at midnight on the 28th night of my tenure. The preparations had been simple but meaningful. I had spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, sitting in the chapel attached to the manor and trying to find the words to express what I felt. The chapel was small and beautiful, its stained glass windows depicting scenes from Scripture, its pews worn smooth by generations of Blackmere worshippers. I had not been particularly religious before coming to this house, but something about the silence of that sacred space touched me deeply. I prayed, though I was not sure to whom. To God, perhaps, or to whatever force governed the boundary between the living and the dead. I prayed for guidance, for strength, for the courage to do what needed to be done. When evening came, I bathed and dressed with care. I had nothing suitable for a wedding, of course, no white gown or veil or orange blossoms. But I had my mother's blue muslin, the dress she had worn on her own wedding day, and it seemed fitting somehow. A connection between the generations, between the love that had created me and the love that I hoped would set Alistair free. I brushed my hair until it gleamed in the candlelight and pinned it up in a simple style that reminded me of the portraits I had seen of Victorian brides. I looked at myself in the clouded mirror of the vanity and saw not the desperate spinster who had answered an advertisement in the newspaper, but a woman transformed by love, a bride. Dorian had found an old prayer book in the chapel, and we improvised a service based on its contents. There were no flowers, no guests, no wedding gown. I wore my best dress, a simple blue muslin that had been my mother's, and Dorian stood beside me in his black evening clothes, his expression a mixture of grief and resignation. We gathered in the east room, the three of us. Dorian stood by the door, and I stood in the center of the room, facing the empty space where I knew Alistair waited. I could feel him there, his presence stronger than ever, vibrating with emotion. "We are gathered here tonight," Dorian began, his voice steady despite the absurdity of what we were doing, "to witness the union of my brother, Alistair James Blackmere, and Miss Vivian Rose Hartley." The words hung in the air, sacred and strange. I felt Alistair's presence draw closer, wrapping around me like an embrace. "Alistair," Dorian continued, "do you take this woman to be your wife? Do you promise to love and cherish her, to honor and protect her, for as long as your spirit endures?" The room grew cold, and I heard the answer in my mind, clear as a bell. "I do." "And Vivian," Dorian said, turning to me, "do you take this spirit to be your husband? Do you promise to love and cherish him, to honor and protect him, for as long as you both shall exist?" I felt tears streaming down my face, but my voice was steady when I answered, "I do." Then, by the power vested in me as head of this household, Dorian said, his voice cracking slightly, "I pronounce you husband and wife. May whatever God watches over us grant you peace." The moment the words left his lips, the room exploded with light. I gasped, shielding my eyes against the sudden brilliance. The cold that had surrounded me intensified and then transformed, becoming warmth, becoming presence, becoming something I could almost touch. I lowered my hands and found myself staring at the most beautiful sight I had ever witnessed. Alistair stood before me, not as a shadow or a presence or a voice in my mind, but as a figure of light, translucent and radiant, his features clear and perfect. He looked exactly as he had in the portrait, young and handsome and full of warmth. But his eyes, those gentle eyes, were fixed on me with an expression of pure, overwhelming love. "Vivian," he said, and his voice was no longer in my mind, but in the air, surrounding me, filling me. "You have freed me." I reached out to touch him, knowing that my hand would pass through empty air. But instead, I felt something solid beneath my fingers, cold and insubstantial, but real, present. "How is this possible?" I whispered. "You gave me what I needed," he said. "Not a wedding, but a love that was true, a love that asked nothing in return, a love that set me free." "I am afraid," I admitted. "Afraid of losing you now that I have finally found you." "You will never lose me." He cupped my face in his translucent hands, and I felt the whisper of his touch like a prayer. "I will always be with you, in your heart, in your memories, in every moment of kindness and compassion you share with the world. But I cannot stay. The light is calling me, and I must go. No." The word tore from my throat, raw and desperate. "Please, I just found you." "And I will wait for you," he said gently, "on the other side of the light. However long it takes, however many years you live, I will be there when you are ready. We will have our forever, Vivian, just not yet." I was weeping openly now, tears streaming down my face in rivers of grief and joy and love so profound it threatened to shatter me. "I love you," I said, "and I love you." He leaned forward and pressed his lips to my forehead. The kiss was cold and warm at the same time, infinite and fleeting, a moment that contained eternity. My bride. Then the light intensified, and he began to fade. I watched, my heart breaking and mending all at once, as the figure of the man I loved dissolved into radiance. His smile was the last thing to go, that warm, gentle smile I had fallen in love with in a portrait, and then he was gone. The room was dark and empty. The presence that had filled it for 6 years had vanished. Alistair Blackmere was finally at peace. I do not know how long I stood there, staring at the space where he had been. Eventually, I became aware of Dorian at my side, his hand on my arm, his voice soft with concern. "Vivian, are you all right?" I turned to face him, and I saw my own grief reflected in his eyes. We had both lost someone tonight, but we had also gained something precious: closure, peace, the knowledge that Alistair was free. "I will be," I said, "in time." The days that followed were strange and quiet. The East Room, which had been cold and heavy for 6 years, felt light and airy now, just another bedroom in a grand old house. The servants, who had avoided that corridor for as long as anyone could remember, began to clean and air it out without prompting. Even the manor itself seemed to breathe easier, as though a weight had been lifted from its ancient stones. My 30 nights came to an end, and Dorian presented me with the £100 as promised. I held the money in my hands, enough to save my mother, enough to change our lives, and felt strangely empty. "What will you do now?" Dorian asked. "Go home," I said. care for my mother, try to rebuild a life. And then? I do not know. I looked up at him, at this man who had helped me set his brother free, who had stood as witness to the strangest wedding in history, who had loved me and let me go. I suppose I will take things one day at a time. He was silent for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "You could stay." I blinked. What? Here, at Blackmere Manor. He held up a hand to forestall my protest. Not as my wife. I know your heart belongs to my brother, but as a friend, a companion, someone to share this ridiculous old house with and keep me from becoming a complete recluse. I thought of my empty home in Cheapside, of the lonely years stretching before me, of a life defined by what I had lost rather than what I might gain. And I thought of Alistair's words, spoken just before he faded into the light. We will have our forever, just not yet. Perhaps staying was not giving up on that promise. Perhaps it was simply living in the meantime. I will consider it, I said. That is all I ask. Dorian smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. Take the time you need, care for your mother, and know that there will always be a place for you here if you want it. I returned to London with £100 and a heart full of contradictions. My mother wept when she saw the money, when she heard that our troubles were over. I did not tell her about Alistair. Some things are too precious and too strange to share, even with those we love most. The months that followed were difficult in ways I had not anticipated. I had expected grief, and grief came, a deep and abiding sorrow that colored every waking moment. But I had not expected the loneliness. I had grown accustomed to Alistair's presence, to our midnight conversations, to the feeling of being truly seen and understood. Without him, the world felt flat and empty, a painting from which all the color had been drained. I wrote to Dorian occasionally, short letters that said nothing of importance. He responded in kind, brief notes that spoke of weather and household matters and the state of the gardens. Neither of us mentioned his brother or the strange ceremony that had bound us together. And then, on a cold evening in February, a letter arrived that changed everything. My dearest Vivian, it read, I hope this finds you well. I am writing to inform you that Mrs. Blackwood has confessed. She came to me last week in a state of great agitation, claiming that her conscience would no longer allow her to remain silent. She has given me a full account of what happened the night my brother died, including the identity of Rosalind's current whereabouts. I have contacted the authorities, and they are pursuing the matter. It seems that justice will finally be served. But that is not why I am writing. I am writing because the house feels empty without you. The gardens are blooming despite the cold, and I find myself wishing you were here to see them. The East Room has been transformed into a sitting room, bright and cheerful, with not a trace of its former darkness. And I have commissioned a portrait to hang beside the one of my brother and me, a portrait of you. I know you do not love me. I know your heart will always belong to Alistair. But I have come to realize that there are many kinds of love and many kinds of happiness. Perhaps we cannot have the great romantic passion of novels and fairy tales, but we could have companionship, friendship, a shared life built on mutual respect and affection. I am asking you to consider my offer once more, not as a proposal of marriage, but as an invitation. Come back to Blackmere. Let us see what we might build together. Yours always, Dorian. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new depths of meaning. He was not asking me to forget Alistair. He was asking me to remember him while still allowing myself to live, to love in whatever way I was capable of loving. I thought of the light in Alistair's eyes as he faded away. I thought of his promise that he would wait for me, and I realized that waiting did not mean being alone. It meant living fully, embracing whatever joy came my way until the time when we could be together again. I wrote my reply that very night. "Dear Dorian," it began, "I am coming home." And so I returned to Blackmere Manor, not as a bride or a lover, but as a friend. Dorian met me at the gates, and I saw the hope in his eyes, the cautious joy of a man who had expected nothing and received everything. The carriage rolled to a stop, and he helped me down with a gentleness that made my heart ache. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a few months since we parted. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before, and a weariness in his bearing that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled days. But when he smiled at me, I saw the warmth beneath the exhaustion, the genuine happiness that my return had brought. "Welcome home," he said softly. "Home." The words settled over me like a blanket, warm and comforting. I had not had a home in so long, not really. My house in Cheapside had been a place of fear and desperation, a constant reminder of everything I had lost and everything I stood to lose. But Blackmere, for all its Gothic gloom and haunted history, felt different. It felt like a place where I might finally belong. The manor itself seemed to greet me as I walked through its doors. The foyer was brighter than I remembered, the curtains drawn back to let in the pale winter sun. Fresh flowers adorned the tables, and the portraits on the walls seemed less stern, less forbidding. Even the portrait of Alistair and Dorian at the base of the stairs seemed somehow lighter, as though a shadow that had hung over it for years had finally been lifted. Dorian gave me a tour of the changes he had made. The conservatory had been restored, its dead plants replaced with living greenery that filled the air with the scent of growth and hope. The music room had been cleaned and polished, the piano tuned and ready to be played. And the east room, my room, had been transformed entirely. Gone were the heavy burgundy curtains that had blocked out the light. Gone was the oppressive atmosphere that had pressed against me every time I crossed the threshold. In their place was a bright, cheerful sitting room, decorated in soft creams and pale blues that caught the light and reflected it back in gentle waves. A fire crackled in the hearth, and comfortable chairs were arranged before it, inviting conversation and companionship. "I thought you might like it," Dorian said, watching my face anxiously. "We can change anything you do not like, of course. I simply wanted you to have a space that felt like yours." I turned to him, tears pricking at my eyes. "It is perfect," I said. "It is absolutely perfect." We built a life together in the years that followed. Not the passionate romance of youth, but something quieter and perhaps more lasting. A partnership of equals, a friendship that deepened with time. He never asked me to forget Alistair, and I never asked him to stop loving me in his own way. We existed in a comfortable middle ground, two people who had been broken by loss and were slowly putting each other back together. Mrs. Blackwood was tried and convicted for her complicity in Alistair's death. She was sentenced to imprisonment, her final years spent in contemplation of her crimes. Rosalind was found in Paris, living under an assumed name with a wealthy industrialist. She was extradited to England and faced justice as well, her beauty and charm no shield against the weight of evidence against her. I did not attend the trial. I had no desire to see the woman who had destroyed so much for so little. The years passed, as years do. My mother recovered her health and lived to see me settled and content. She passed peacefully in her sleep when I was 32, and I buried her in the Blackmere family plot, beside the man who should have been my husband in truth. Dorian and I never married. He asked once, on a summer evening when the gardens were in full bloom, and I declined with gentleness and honesty. He accepted my refusal with grace, and we never spoke of it again. He understood, I think, that my heart was already given, that I was simply waiting for the day when I could fulfill the promise I had made in a darkened room so many years ago. I am writing this now at the age of 53, in the sitting room that was once the east room of Blackmere Manor. Dorian sits across from me, reading by the fire, his hair gray now, but his eyes still sharp. We have spent nearly 30 years together, and I regret nothing. He gave me a home when I had none, a family when I was alone, a purpose when I had lost my way. But sometimes, late at night, when the fire has burned low and the house is quiet, I feel a presence beside me. Not cold, not frightening, but warm and gentle and infinitely patient. And I hear a voice, soft as a whisper, speaking words that only I can hear. Soon, my bride. Soon. I know that when my time comes, he will be there, waiting for me in the light, and we will finally have our forever. Until then, I will live. I will love. I will remember. And I will never, ever forget the ghost who called me his bride.